So, John, I do a terrible job of introducing people. So, just FYI, I'm not going to do a terrible job today because
Good.
been trying to get together with you and your team and your crew for, I don't know, 8 weeks now or something like that. And the first time I was like, dang, man, everyone's too busy. And I get it, right? You guys are in the academic world that I used to be in. And it's, fall semester, people are starting to teach again, students are back, lives are busy. But I really appreciate you reaching back out and going, hey, we'd like to do this. We'd like to be on the podcast and just have a really thoughtful, sort of open discussion around what you guys did and what you found. Because I feel like your science is great. Number one, I feel like number two, there are a couple of pieces in the paper that have been overlooked by people there's obviously the headline pieces that everyone is focusing on, but I think that there's some other cool pieces of the study that are in there that are like, why is anybody looking at that? That's pretty cool right there. So John Randolph, welcome to the Blood Origins podcast. You come to us from Utah, right? Utah State University?
Yep. USU.
Oh, you finished your PhD, in your PhD, associate professor in where are you? What are you doing? Give us the download.
Yeah. So I finished my master's. This was my master's thesis here at Utah State University. So what brought me here was I've been working for the past 5 years for a nonprofit organization, the Institute for Wildlife Studies, out of California. And during that time, the president and my supervisor, David Garswan, was like, hey, you've been working on this mountain lion project. If you want to take it the next step and go to grad school with it, the door is open for that. So then I just reached out to a couple professors. Dr. Julie Young was on the top of my list. And I ended up here, and that was in 2022. And I defended and graduated last spring. So now I'm back with the Institute for Wildlife Studies as just a wildlife biologist managing the mountain lion project in northeastern California.
Fantastic, man. Fantastic. I didn't know about the sort of institute. I saw that on paper in terms of the funding institute, funding information. I didn't know that you had come from the Institute of Wildlife Studies. Can you give us a little bit of background of what IWS does?
Whole lot of stuff.
Okay, cool. Well, let's get specific. What are you guys doing? What are you doing what did you do on the mountain lion study that led to you going to Utah State?
Yeah. So the Mountain Lion Project started in 2016. This was before my time. I started in 2019. But it originally started because up in northeastern California in Modoc, the pronghorn population has just been struggling. And so partnering with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, we started a pronghorn research project up there. And the first year, investigations on mortality showed a lot of mountain lions taking pronghorn, which isn't that common. So that kind of sparked the interest of, wait, maybe we should be looking at mountain lions here. We talked to the state and we got approval to start the mountain lion project. So simultaneously, we had the pronghorn project going and the mountain lion project starting in 2016.
And they didn't have any, were there just no mule deer around? No whitetail around?
There's mule deer up there. That was the whole question because pronghorn aren't a huge portion of the diet, prey selection wise. So when the project started getting in, my old supervisor, John Ivanek, he did his master's on habitat features that end up creating, a kill site. So his whole idea.
Sorry to interrupt you, but
yeah, you're fine.
It makes sense, right? Pronghorn are, super well sighted, live in open plains. They don't live in craggy, mountainous kind of places that you think mountain lions typically inhabit. And then if a mountain lion wants to go after a pronghorn, like how the hell, it's not a cheetah.
Exactly. And that's what was so interesting about this. So what John's hypothesis and thoughts were that the juniper encroachment into the sage steppe habitat was creating more ambush cover for them and therefore letting those mountain lions get a little bit closer. And actually pronghorn do have amazing eyesight, but at close proximity, they actually can't focus too well. So I have, when we are catching pronghorn fawns, I have crawled into 30 meters from a pronghorn and I hit a stick and she got me. and I just didn't move. And she actually walked up to me about 10 meters away, trying to investigate as if I heard something here. I know it's here, but I can't find it. I just curled up behind a bush. And I got some really cool, pictures and stuff of this pronghorn doe. She broke off from the herd and definitely dropped a fawn in there. So that's why I was going in to investigate her fawn and try and capture it. But yeah, so it was just a really unique situation we were observing there, starting with that pronghorn and leading into the mountain lion project. So John wrapped up in 2019 out of Humboldt State. He finished, moved on, and then I kind of took over the reins and continued on just capturing mountain lions. And at that time, we started really getting into the reproductive biology, den site selection, because these females are denning up and have to stay within a certain area close enough to be able to get back to the den. And they also need to feed themselves while also feeding those kittens, which is a very much energetically demanding on them. So we started getting into that. And that was kind of when the doors opened and Dave offered the project data for me to take the next step. So my big thing was, all right, if we're on the reproductive biology side, let's look at juvenile dispersal. I've been in communication with Nevada and Oregon, who are from Alturas, California, 40-minute drive north or 40-minute drive east of us. So right there, asking about how many lions we have pushing into those areas. So the connectivity with those other states, because mountain lions don't see state lines and borders, was a real big question that pushed this along.
Were you in that initial mountain lion study that led to this work that we're going to discuss?
Mm-hmm.
Were you already collaring mountain lions and looking at how they were moving in the landscape?
So we're looking at prey selection. So that original study was pretty much the moment a GPS collared lion. So yes, sorry, we were collaring the lions. And the moment they clustered up, which is when their GPS points start just dropping in the same location, that means they probably made a kill. John would go in immediately and investigate that kill and try and track back from the cache site. Usually the lion will drag it to the cache site from the kill site. And then he would pretty much just be an investigator and go backwards and work all the way back to trying to find the point of first contact, which is sometimes 2 tracks in a striding width, and then, a tuft of deer hair hang like just on the side. Really difficult stuff, but I mean, yeah, really neat.
It's like African tracking stuff, man.
Exactly. He's taught me a lot about tracking when I was with him there.
So you did this work, and I assume the work that you were doing here, is this the same area that you picked up for the study in terms of the California area?
Yes. Yep. Northeastern California, Modoc County primarily. We sometimes get down into Lassen.
So you went over to Utah. David was David at Utah, or was he just affiliated with Julie's at Utah? And David said, yes, let's do this. Let's expand the study. Julie was like, yep, super interested in doing it. Let's do it.
Yeah, exactly. So Dave Garcelon, his affiliations are with Humboldt State, but actually Julie and Dave worked together a couple years back. So there was already a connection there. So when I showed interest, there was already, a relationship there, which was nice.
So this whole conversation that we're having comes from a research paper. And it's funny, now that I'm in this world, when I was a professor at Mississippi State, I was a professor in the Wildlife Fisheries Department for 6 years. I published over 100 peer-reviewed articles. Not one of them garnered, attention, except beyond the academic world, right? Because you do it for what you do it for, right? You're academics. That's what you're doing it for. Mm-hmm. But I think maybe a little naively from my perspective, and obviously you living in the mountain lion world, there's a lot more controversy around it, that any science that's being done in these controversial worlds, can be elevated and can be used and can be put into press, and people want to talk about it like we're talking about it today, and people want to write about it, and people want to shift an opinion left or right,
Yeah, 100%. That was, this is my first peer-reviewed article, and when I got the
Wow.
email saying, "Hey,
Wow.
look at this," I was like, "Oh my gosh, I thought I'd have a buffer of 2 to 3 papers, hopefully, before something gets ran off with, or, both sides start pulling at what they want." hmm
So the research article was published in Ecology and Evolution. By the way, great journal for your first freaking ever publication. Well done.
Thank you.
The research article was called Impacts of Management Practices on Habitat Selection During Juvenile Mountain Lion Dispersal. It's a great paper, got a bunch of statistics in it. We're not going to get into statistics because we want people to keep listening to this podcast. But really, I think there's a lot of cool things that happened in this project, and what you did was very interesting in that you sort of compared two different populations, one being in California that comes as a result of, well, not comes of, but is in a state where mountain lion hunting was banned in the mid 70s, and compared it to a place like Nevada where mountain lion hunting is definitely occurring, as well as not just hunting, but the use of hounds in mountains, in the landscapes for exercising, chasing lions outside of hunting season. So almost like a hazing kind of situation, but not really a hazing situation. And really, you took those two things, you're like, all right, let's have a look at the differences between the two, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was kind of interesting coming into grad school at USU and joining the lab. The biggest thing that Julie Young told me, she's like, you have a small sample size. Like, we had 13 juveniles from California. At that time, that's all I had. So I asked Dr. David Stoner to join my committee, and he said the exact same thing. Man, John, you have a small sample size. And then a few weeks later, he's like, "Hey, I was looking at my data. I have some juvenile mountain lions that dispersed from a Great Basin population. Would you be interested in that?" And really, like, I can't thank him enough for that opportunity, because it really bolstered this paper and my whole thesis into, the final form it took for the publication. So
talk to somebody who doesn't understand science and the need for sample size being as large as possible.
So in the science world, samples are like everything. It's pretty much money for us. If we have a big enough sample size, we can shrink down the individual variability. So like each person is different, right? So if we have 100 people and we only grab 5 people and we average that out, there's going to be a lot more individuality in that group of 5 compared to if we pulled 35, 45 people. We'll be getting closer to that 100-person mean. That's probably the easiest way to explain it.
And it's funny, today's, and the people are like, well, why don't you just do them all, right? Well, number one, nobody has all the money to do them all. And that's the major constraint here. We don't have the time or the money, or mostly the money, right?
Yes, 100%.
Interestingly enough, there is, with so much development in the research and development world today, things that used to be like, I'll use drone technology as an example. Drone sampling with infrared now to determine population sizes. Like before, you're like, oh, okay, we got a basin of 200,000 hectares, right? If you took a drone, you may not have had the infrared technology. Number one, you'd have to do a camera trap survey, stratified, whatnot, and did some extrapolations from there. But now with infrared and the drone technology the way that it is, you could almost sample 100% of 200,000 hectares and get an exact count, and not do it over a 10-week time frame in which there's mixing. You could do it in 2 nights.
Yeah, it's crazy how fast technology is improving and benefiting us researchers. The only kicker to that all is money. It's expensive to get drone hours. It's expensive to do all this stuff, to slap collars on animals. It's just expensive overall. But it is impressive how far we've came from putting out or just observational field stuff back in the 1930s, when people would just follow tracks and talk about prey selection that way.
100%. 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So let me, I want to just read from the abstract because I don't want to make up my own terms. And then what I want you to do is I want you to take the lead from there. I want you to sort of explain the study. I want you to explain, what you came what sort of the conclusions you came to. But here's what it says in the abstract. And for anybody who is not a scientist, who wants to understand science, I would highly suggest you read the abstract. The abstract is a summary of the paper. It's a summary of why you're doing it. Here's what we did. Here's how we analyzed it. And here are the key results from it. If you want to learn a little bit more about the paper, read the introduction. And then I would suggest reading the conclusion. The results and the methods are going to scramble your brains.
Most definitely.
And so this is what it says. Results revealed consistent habitat selection between sites across most landscape variables, with one notable exception: anthropogenic covariates, which include distance to developed lands, distance to hay and crop, which is something I want to talk about, and the distance to four-wheel drive roads were only statistically significant on modeled habitat selection during dispersal in the population subject to hunting, i.e. Nevada. Results suggest that hunting, pursuit with hounds resulting in harvest, and non-lethal pursuit with hounds but no harvest allowed, i.e. hazing or exercising, I'm ad-libbing with that, increase avoidance of anthropogenic landscapes during dispersal for juvenile mountain lions.
Yeah,
pretty deep, pretty amazing results.
So, and that's a big thing. I'm happy to take the reins here on this. Is this whole opportunity came up with, David Stoner giving me the data, and then we went through this looking at what habitats these juvenile mountain lions are using versus what habitats they're not using. And that's when it gets into the statistical modeling stuff. But pretty much I chose specific covariates or variables like forest, shrub, topography, elevation, terrain ruggedness, and then also anthropogenic ones that I thought might be influencing these movements across the landscape. So that's kind of the whole premise of like what we built with the data in hand. And then once we started running this through, we got all of our selection results or avoidance results here. And within that, our study was not a cause and effect study. So our whole discussion is all correlation. What we had to do is we had to take the results at hand, what we knew, which is that they're selected for forest, shrub, elevation, and then also avoiding the anthropogenic landscapes. And we had to tie that into previous literature or even just our own mountain lion ecology knowledge. And looking at this, the biggest difference between these two populations just kept coming back to the fact that Nevada was a state that allows hunting. So we started digging in a little bit more on that. And that's like really what formed our discussion, and what we tried to build on is like dispersal is a risky situation for these mountain lions to leave the range they know, where mom was protecting them for almost 2 years pretty much, or raising them, and then go out on their own and find a habitat of their own, establish an adult home range. And during that time, the question of just risk kept coming up. And are these mountain lions going to be running into other adult males who are intolerant? Are they going to be easier to tree from houndsmen? Are they even going to be harvested by the houndsmen if they are treed as well? So all that just started really in conversation with my committee and stuff, really bubbling up our discussion here. So overall, we found that, as you mentioned, mountain lions are behaving like mountain lions when it comes to natural landscapes. Forest, shrub, elevation, terrain ruggedness, all that stuff.
No difference between California and Nevada. They're doing the same things as mountain lions do.
They're both selecting similarly. They're selecting it at different rates, but similarly. So that was the first key that really helped us along with this big difference we found with the avoidance of developed landscapes is, wait, these animals, though geographically distant, like distinct populations, they are behaving similarly, which was neat to see. and I think helped us when we turned to our differences, and those differences of the avoidance of anthropogenic landscapes, as well as the selection for hay and crop, was a really, curious note that came up, or signal that we saw. So I'll hit both of those separately here, but with the selection for the forest, shrubland, and topography, a lot of that just ties back into where are deer found? Where is that main resource found for mountain lions? And the one driver, I believe, is prey drive everything for carnivores. Like that's just, they migrate with them, they move with them. That's it. And one caveat to this study that I'd like to point out is that I didn't have data available to me to include prey density in both of my sites. So there is a possibility that some of these correlations that we're working off of could just be related to deer in Nevada all in ag fields, or deer are differently distributed across the two study sites. So I just want to kind of put that out there. But I think really the selection for those natural covariates are driven by the deer, the prey species. But then when we shift and see a selection for hay and crop in Nevada, our hunted population, it really brought up a lot of questions for us overall, because depredation is a big issue, especially in California. It's a hot topic all over. But in the hunt zones that our Nevada site was in, there was only one depredation event across the years of this study. So it's not as
How many
high of an
depredation events
issue.
were in California over the same time frame?
I believe it was, sorry, I don't want to get the number wrong.
That's fine. Take your time.
Give me 2 seconds here. Between 2018 and 2022, 15 mountain lions were removed from our protected site.
Wow. Wow.
So 15 animals, but that is right next to the 2017 push for the 3 strikes and the initiation of all the non-lethal deterrent steps that had to follow before a lethal permit could be submitted. So I believe of those 15, 2018 was one of the highest, and then it pittered out. And I believe the 2022 year, there were 0 depredation events. So I think that also is something to consider overall. So yeah, there wasn't a lot of depredation occurring in our Nevada study site, but these lions were still selecting areas where, small hoofed stock sheep, goats are all in those areas. But also deer are really attracted to ag. I mean, you see it all over. They're in the ag fields all the time. It's a predictable resource, especially in Caliente, Nevada, southeastern Nevada. It's a very harsh environment, and it can swing sometimes where they go through drought and there's no water. But in agricultural fields, in that landscape, there's water year round. So those prey species move in, and then what we think might be occurring is the mountain lions, the juveniles specifically, are moving along in their dispersal and realizing that there's a high resource in these areas. And because they're inexperienced hunters, they have maybe only killed 1 or 2 things at some points in their dispersal. They're going to be driven to these areas with higher hunting opportunities. Additionally, on top of that is there's a lot of roads around ag, and I'm sure you drive down any ag road, there's probably a roadkill ground squirrel, a roadkill deer at times. And so that's providing almost an easy meal for them to scavenge and pick up. Actually, one of our lions in California, he was doing his dispersal, and there's a highway 139 that just deer get hit on all the time. And I went into one of his kill sites or his clusters to see what he killed, and I tracked it back 150 meters to the highway, to a pile of glass and car parts, and then where the deer was laying. So right there is evidence that, if they come across it and it's not super rotten, they're going to use it. So that also helps the hay and agricultural areas be beneficial to these lions.
Did you not see the same thing in California though? That was, to me, it was like, I was like, okay, number one, I thought, yes, I thought that the hay crop situation of juvenile mountain lions and them interacting with those fields was fascinating. made complete sense. I didn't think about the roadkill aspect of things
Mm-hmm.
there. That also makes complete sense. But my question was, why didn't we see it in California? Was
Yeah,
the hay
and
crop system, the prey, you would think it would be the same, but it wasn't.
hmm and that is something that we scratched our heads a good bit about is what is the difference? And when I think of our site in Modoc County in California, I think of it as a donut shape where that center hole of the donut is Alturas, and that's where all the crops are. And then everything around it is really good, suitable habitat for mountain lions. And just thinking about topography too, they like to follow mountain ranges or cliffs edges, and a lot of those are running north south and not leading into the town of Alturas, where all the agricultural landscape centrally localizes at. But Nevada, from my understanding, in Caliente, from Caliente, if you move south, it is a massive canyon with
Okay.
the only water source, perennial water source year round. And on both sides of the canyon, or at least majorly on one side, is all the agriculture. So I think that agriculture in Nevada also shows up in a little bit better area for mountain lions to just naturally come by and be like, oh, wow. Because they like to walk those high cliffs. They like to be observant, and ag fields just
So maybe it was a
deer out in
landscape,
the
sort
open.
of landscape feature funnel kind of scenario.
Yeah, I think it facilitated why they might be there. But it was a really interesting thing because on top of that, the other 2 points we made in the paper was one that adult mountain lions rarely use that if they have agriculture in their lands in their home range. They don't use it heavily, but also hay and crop is largely private and inaccessible to hunters or even just the public for recreational stuff. So some of these Western ranches are massive, have huge fields, and the density of people disturbance is low. But also, not everyone lets hunters come onto their property to hunt. So it could also be just allowing for a refuge to appear where if they walk a fine line and don't take a sheep or a goat, they have resources available to them and somewhat a refuge and protection too.
Yeah, that was again, that was one of the things that stood out to me that I think didn't get much attention in the media.
Yeah, it was quite interesting.
But it's not as sexy as, the management practice. And I think that's, the key here. And maybe, again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what you guys found from the study was that there was not a cause and effect, but there was a correlation between management practices like hunting and juvenile mountain lion dispersal.
Yeah. So the way we like to say it is there is a correlation, and we're searching for suggestions to why it could be correlated. And that all comes to the fact that I can't say 100% that my Nevada mountain lions in this study were chased by hounds. Obviously, they weren't four were harvested, but that's not a learning curve. Once you're harvested, you don't learn anything from that experience. But
could
overall,
you tell based on the GPS data? I'm curious. Could you tell from the GPS data whether or not if they were like, Bart George, Bart, obviously in Washington, he'll say like, oh yeah, the cat hears the dogs. Like I can see it. Again, I don't know if it's tracking pace or whatnot, a GPS point, but you talked about behavior in the paper, behavior of juvenile mountain lions, and I don't necessarily think you need to be hunted, but rather just the echo of dogs and that mountain lion going in one direction and going, I'm heading in the opposite direction at a different pace or something.
Yeah. So from our GPS points off the collars, they drop every 4 hours.
Oh, okay.
So a run could be there and gone, and the lion's just meandering along after he got treed for 2 hours of that situation. And I think I'm not real familiar with Bart George's project, but I'm sure he has a lower fixed rate is what it's called, like 15 minutes. You could do 5 minutes if you wanted to, but it'd be really interesting to watch that occur and see on that line, similar to what Bart is doing. But I do think there is a possibility of these cats to start learning. After my paper was published, a houndsman reached out to me and he was like, "Hey, I just read your paper. I love your piece in there on the dogs." He's like, "I've ran a specific lion multiple times to re-collar her across years." And he's like, "She gets harder to catch every single time. Or she bumps because you'll walk in with VHF, high frequency that just beeps. And depending on how much or how loud the beep is, let's say, that's how close you are." And he says like he'll be walking in and his dogs are working, trying to catch up to her. And all of a sudden she's gone. And he's like, it just slowly got to be where she just would get out of dodge. And I think that's real
Which
interesting.
it speaks to your paper, though. It speaks to behavioral changes as a result of a management practice like hunting.
Yes, 100%, 100%. And that was really satisfying for me to hear, a houndsman out there that has observed this. You see people talk about it, but somebody I know and how they work is like valuable in my opinion.
No, look, I think that there's two things that have been a little bit misconstrued and misrepresented in the public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, the definitiveness that because of hunting, juvenile mountain dispersal doesn't interact with human landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
I will say it. The definitiveness is not correct. Okay? What you have done in your study is you have proved that there is a correlation, a strong correlation. Can I say that? What was the R squared on the correlation?
I don't even know if we can say strong correlation. I think this is just us interpreting our results. And the biggest difference that we see between our two populations is that one is hunted. And that's kind of the umbrella we put over our hunted site, was that we don't know if these cats were actually chased during the collaring or had experience hunting, but overall that population had been hunted for many, many years.
And
so
is correlated to acting differently.
Yes,
in terms of how it uses the landscape.
That's what we're trying to tie it all together to. And really, I view my paper as a T-ball stand for somebody else to walk up and hit the next project out, because
that's the point of science, right?
Exactly. I don't have a huge study sample. I don't have all the stuff in this paper to bolster a definitive decision on it, but I can suggest things based off of our findings. And that's where, as you're saying, the definitiveness is being used on both sides. And really, this is just a suggestion. And I know, Bart George, as we mentioned, he's doing some great stuff up in Washington. My advisor, Julie Young, she has a project starting with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who they are looking at non-lethal deterrence and the efficacy of those deterrents in California, where all these landowners have to do these steps for non-lethal deterrence before they can have a lethal deterrent. So their project aims to, I'm going to read this off of just it's doing. The project aims to evaluate effectiveness of non-lethal deterrence, and those deterrents could be hazing or motion-activated triggers, whether it's noise or flashing lights, turboflaggery, in preventing cougar depredation, and to also define, and I think this is a really cool part of the project, define cougars' spatial temporal reactions to those deterrents. So how does that deterrent affect the cat, and how does it displace them from the location, or how do they move after that deterrent occurs or interaction happens?
I like it, man. And look, that's the kind of data you need, right? It is the kind of data that also, again, when you think about it, California hasn't had mountain lion hunting since 1977. If you have data, and Julie's going into it completely unbiased, is the non-lethal stuff being effective?
Yeah.
Or is it not being effective? And if it's not being effective, okay, what do you do next?
What are the next steps? And that's the biggest thing. I mean, I think a really interesting way to look at the whole use of hounds as hazing in my paper is to, you know, if we remove a lion for depredation, that lion is removed, and that's a short-term fix, right? Because of the social organization of mountain lions, they just move back in. Something does, one or two do, but then that issue could occur again. So when I work with landowners, I tell them, I'm like, hey, if you have a lion around your ranch, you see it on trail cameras, whatnot. If it's not messing with you, that's a good lion. Like that's good to have, because if you were to remove it, you have no idea the next lion you might have move in there. And then that lion could also be good, or it could just start killing your sheep or something. So the use of the hounds as a hazing method could also teach, I want to use air quotations here, the resident lion to avoid that human area or that livestock location. And therefore, like, it could create a long-term effect where we're not removing the individual, but that individual just begins to avoid that location. And I'm sure it's going to be, a lot of nuance to that. And it's going to be a hard project to do because people are going to have to take risks for the research to actually be proven. But it's just one of those things where it's a method that's underutilized, but also it's used in black bears.
Yeah.
I have good friends with Nevada Department of Wildlife, John and Becca, and their dog Badger, a Karelian bear dog, who, when they have nuisance black bears, they capture the black bear and they chase them with that dog on that relocation, so that that bear has that mind of, wow, that was terrible, never going back there.
Well, John, I really appreciate you, man. As I said, I wanted to have you guys on as a collective, and you were the chosen spokesperson to come forward. And I really appreciate you just giving us sort of the lay of the land around the paper and like, okay, this is what it says. And it's a valuable contribution to science. And as you said, it's always, science is always like, okay, we've solved this, not solved. We've answered to the best of our abilities this question, but exactly. it's led to 5 other questions, which is,
and that's good science right there. That's exactly what we want to see, and how we do figure out these questions or these issues. And and there's the one last thing on this paper I'd like to point out is that juvenile mountain lions are just wandering, looking for a home. So running into a dog when you're a young individual in a new landscape you don't understand might be a little bit more persuasive to that individual, where they're going to be like, wow, that was terrible, not ever going there again. Or if I hear a dog bark, I am getting out. Where a resident lion might also be a little bit more stubborn on site fidelity. So like, they're established, they have a home range. So if a dog chases them, they're not going to up and move this home range that they have fought for, how long to maintain. So I think there's a little bit of nuance there too, where juveniles are a little bit more malleable, and those adults might be a little bit more, this is my home range, this is where I'm going to live.
Yeah, but it also speaks to, take it one step further. It also speaks to, those juvenile mountain lions are going to be the ones moving across the landscape more than your typical adults. They're the ones that probably are going to interact with human landscapes more, probably going to come across pets and livestock more, and are going to be opportunistic in those takes because of their lack of experience in taking things.
Exactly.
And if there are hounds working in the landscape, in the system, whether hazing or hunting or whatnot, as your paper showed, there is a correlation with that behavior of juvenile mountain lions going, don't want to be a part of that.
Yeah.
Going to stay away from that, which is something that people want to understand, right? It's like, if there is some sort of relationship there, some sort of correlation there, and there is no correlation in a place that isn't hunted, I don't want mountain lions interacting with me or my livestock or whatnot. Maybe we should just keep these guys around for a little bit,
Exactly. So I feel like all my study did was open up a can of worms on 30 questions.
This is what you know, it is science. I like to call it academic job security.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to look at it.
John, you're the man. If we can do anything for you, please let me know. And I don't know if you've checked out Lionheart yet.
I haven't. I was on the website yesterday preparing for this, and I came across this, so I'll be sure to watch Lionheart. I'm excited.
It dropped yesterday.
Okay.
It's going gangbusters right now, but it was
Awesome.
specifically built for non-hunters, for them to understand a lion houndsman, their relationship with their dogs, and the relationship they had with the lion. And
that's great.
It's our best piece of work that we've ever done. Yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think, all right?
I will. We'll be in touch.
Yes, sir.
All right. Have a good day.